Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the health program, the stories we tell, HBCUs and Black women. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have an amazing panel of women scholars, and I'm so excited to be able to represent on behalf of Health, the Higher Education Leadership Foundation. Welcome to the Health. We'll give it a minute as we're getting a little bit of feedback, but I promise you that it will be worth the few minutes of wait. All right. We'll try again. So again, welcome. Welcome to the health panel on women today. We have an exciting experience for you. And I want to first say thank you to President Felton, who has taken so much time to make sure that this panel came to you. It is Women's History Month. And as Women's History Month, we get to celebrate all kinds of ways, but we thought it to be important to bring African-American Black scholar women together to be able to discuss our experiences in higher education, particularly at HBCUs. So today, the stories we tell, HBCUs and Black women, a virtual panel, is today's discussion. And it will be a lively discussion, not only about what our experiences are, but this major scholarship that each one of these scholars on the line have produced. And so at this time, what I want to do is just take a few minutes to frame this idea of Women's History Month and this idea of this panel. And thank you all so much for taking your time to participate, but also to the audience for taking your time to be a part of this. So why is Women's History Month important? Well, it's important just like Black History Month is important. It's an opportunity for us to share the contributions that women have given to the world. Particularly as African-American women or Black women, what we have contributed is beyond what can be put into a textbook. And so I am reminded of the book by Paula Giddens, When and Where I Enter, where there's a discussion about how Black women show up into spaces, particular types of spaces, how we show up and what we contribute and what the world can take away. And so today, I hope this panel, no, I know this panel, will provide that experience for you as we talk about HBCU, Black women, and scholarship. So as we get started here today, I want to introduce our panelists. And I can't say enough of how excited. So from time to time, you're gonna see me get really giddy because I don't think people realize how important women scholars are in the academy, particularly in HBCUs. And these two women that we have here today have provided us with much information, much scholarship, much knowledge, and continue to contribute to the canon. So as we celebrate Women's History Month, I want to first introduce Dr. Tamika Hobbs. And Dr. Hobbs is at Florida Memorial College down there in Miami area. And she has a degree from Florida A&M University, which is also my alma mater. So there's a little bit of a grin here. So sorry, we'll do that for a few minutes. I want to share just very quickly, she is an associate provost at Florida Memorial College, and she is also the launching director for their Center for Social Justice. And she'll share more about that. But I also wanted to share about one of her books, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. And I remember reading this book, and to me, it's one that's also very important right now. As we think about how racial violence continues to show up in our society, how police and policing is integrated into that historical legacy of lynching, and today how we are experiencing the deaths of many persons at the hands of police and at the hands of others. And so I invite everyone, if you have not read that book, to take a moment and read that. To get it, you can get it online, you can get it on your Kindle. And it's a very good read, and it puts you into the mind frame to connect the dots as well. So thank you for that reading. Dr. Cheryl Mango is at Virginia State University. She's an assistant professor. Has several awards and several scholarships, and is known for being the first, or being considered to be the first faculty member to teach a course on the history of HBCUs. And I think that is interesting in of itself, that at HBCUs, the idea that there had not been a course at all of our campuses that speak to the history, the tradition, the story, the advocacy, the resistance of our HBCUs. And so I say congratulations to you as well for having that idea and putting it into motion. So with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. What say you all, women? Absolutely. So if you could just share a little bit more about yourselves and maybe some of the work that you're working on right now, some of your scholarship that you're working on right now.
So I'll jump in, and thanks to Health, thanks to President Felton, thank you to you, Dr. Bradley, for this opportunity. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you. So you mentioned that I'm at Florida Memorial Capital University. You're taking us back to 2004. I'm gonna have to hear about that later.
Sorry.
But yes, down in Miami Gardens. I have been here in my role as a historian roughly since 2012. This is interesting for me. I came back in July of 2019 as an administrator, and it is a different role. It is definitely a different role. I try to keep up with my activities, my professional activities, my research. My background actually is in public history. That's really where I cut my teeth. Dr. Bradley, you remember the Black Archives, the famous Black Archives on the campus of Florida A&M. I worked there all through my undergraduate years. I worked in the community at the John Gilmore Riley Center. I thought that my career trajectory would keep me in those spaces. I've been in academia in and out, but I find that what has always stayed with me is the public programming around Black history. And so that has been the part of my work that I have been able to move forward. I will also say that one of the other projects that is close to my heart is the history of Florida Memorial University. And I'm again, very thankful to be here with you, Dr. Mango. I heard about what you were doing. It is incredibly exciting, as Dr. Bradley pointed out. Can't believe it took all this while, but I'm so glad that you're at the forefront and leading that. And I just have to say, my link to Florida Memorial is quite interesting. It was actually founded in 1879 in my hometown of Live Oak, Florida, up in rural North Florida, Swanee County, not very far from the Georgia border. But this college has moved to 4 different communities over that time. It was founded in Live Oak. There was a racialized attack. A school building was shot up in 1892 that precipitated the splintering of the institution. One of its predecessors sprung up in Jacksonville as the Florida Baptist Academy. It subsequently, after being landlocked, moved to St. Augustine, just 18 miles south. Within the course of the civil rights movement, as Dr. King came to town, there were wade-ins, swim-ins. Our students were a part of that. And while we won the particular battle with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, our college became a target, and our students became the subject of economic reprisals. And it ultimately led the leadership of the school to relocate us again to our current home in South Florida. And I love to tell that story because it is one of resiliency, but it also tracks with the ups and downs of Black history in the United States. And so I applaud Dr. Mango for the work that she's doing to elevate and help people to understand the role that we play. I'm so grateful for the example of Vice President Kamala Harris now, folks like Stacey Abrams, Keisha Lance Bottoms, Raphael Warnock, who are bringing the excellence that is this HBCU education and training into the forefront, and to know that we have people who are keeping the flame. So that is one interest that I have, and then I'm also working on another book that would be the next extension really of the lynching violence. Lynching, as we know, does begin to fade, but we also begin to see the white power structure use that judicial system as a way to punish. And so back up in North Florida in Quincy, which is the county seat of Gaston, Gaston County, I want to tell the story. I'm working on telling the story of the Quincy five African-American men who were falsely accused of murder and burglary, devastated their lives. Justice still really hasn't been done in that case, but I'm working actively to do what I can with some partners. Writing partners are very key to a person trying to maintain scholarship as an administrator, but I hope that will be my next project.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Health, Dr. Felton, Dr. Bradley. Thank you to Dr. Hobbs. And I just commend all of you for the great work that you have done. Now, I did notice a bit of bias. I am a graduate of Grambling, and I know that FAMU has moved to the SWAC. So I noticed I didn't hear that I graduated from Grambling. So I know y'all getting your napkins ready for when y'all have to cry when y'all face us in the SWAC. But that's okay. That's okay. We used to it at Grambling. We used to it. Often imitated but never duplicated. But that's okay. No, it's all in HBCU love. But yes, I am a graduate of Grambling State University in Louisiana. And I think I got my master's at Louisiana Tech, and I'm a graduate of Morgan State University for its PhD program. So, and I made a consistent, concerted effort to be an HBCU product. And it extends from my experience as a child of two Grambling graduates, my mother having to sell the milk cow for her to attend college. And she had 9 siblings and she was the oldest. My father coming from a very poor home and getting a scholarship and going to the NFL from Grambling under the great Eddie Robinson. I remember those stories. I remember them telling me, Cheryl, none of this would have been possible had it not been for Grambling and other HBCUs. We did not have another opportunity. We could not attend Louisiana Tech. We could not attend LSU. So I often thought about how HBCUs were so central to my experience and how my experience is replicated over and over and over again across African American history. So you can pretty much say that I made a decision early on. I remember being a young activist in my small hometown in Louisiana and Walmart and saying, wait a minute, you got LSU stuff in here. Where's the Grambling stuff? Where's the Southern stuff? And, I remember that consciousness of what HBCUs had done for me, what it had done for my family, what it had done for so many Blacks, being central, a central motivating factor in my professional aspirations. So I'd just like to begin with that and a little bit more about me. Being a PhD student at a HBCU was a very, very, very great experience for me. And I had the ability to compare it and contrast it with my experience at a very conservative master's program at Louisiana Tech. But being surrounded by 12 future PhDs in African and African American history, the level of discussion, the level of critical analysis, our preparation was not one of a conservative preparation. We were prepared. We were ready to go out and create and rewrite the story of African and African American history in a way that came from our narrative, in a way that benefited us, in a way that allowed us to be determining of our future. And so I highly credit my PhD experience at Morgan State University, which was intentional. It was an intentional choice to go to HBCU to get my PhD because this experience with HBCUs came so early on. I knew what I wanted to do. This vision was so profound early on. I remember just being inspired by stories of Mary McLeod Bethune and so forth. And so it led me to create the first, what we believe is the first HBCU history course, but that's not it. I actually created and the founding creator of the HBCU Studies academic discipline. I created an entire discipline in which I laid out the philosophical and practical basis for HBCU studies in a recent publication coming out with Decon, the Journal of HBCU Leadership by Health, because I realized that HBCUs needed to be studied. They deserve scholar, that we treated them as if they were some type of vanity project and we cheered them on, but they needed to be studied. They needed systems of self-correction. We don't just need the study of the HBCU in history. We need the study of the HBCU in business. We need the study of the HBCU in sociology. We need the study of the HBCU. What is the psychology of the HBCU student? We need the study of the HBCU student in political science. We need to know how these public policies are affecting our schools. And so this HBCU studies, the HBCU studies course, i.e. my history course, is just the beginning to what I hope is going to be a bold, robust HBCU studies curriculum. Just like African-American history, just like women's history, just like African history, just like Black church history, it takes the intense scholarly treatment of a subject to sensitize the public to its needs and desires and to provide a system of self-correction. So HBCU studies is also about providing a systematic system of self-correction for HBCUs. It's one thing to have our complaints or to also have our joys, but how do we put this into a system where we can replicate it? Because it's one thing that HBCUs have that no other set of institutions almost in this country has, and that's a record of non-discrimination. And that history, it calculates and it computes in almost a metadata format. We don't have to apologize for our history. As a matter of fact, we deserve redress for our history. And so HBCU studies is about securing that. And so I'll talk about my second area of research, really was my primary. I interned at the White House Initiative on HBCUs for about 3 years under Obama administration when I was a doctoral student at Morgan. In my dissertation and my major research, I have a publication coming out with the Journal of Federal History that talks about the history of this office. And it's so interesting. I couldn't believe that my area of research all of a sudden was just on the middle of the presidential stage. My primary area of research is HBCUs and American presidents. It's so interesting because that office is so obscure. And so probably a lot of people who work there don't understand the history of that office and the history of federal allocations and private funding to HBCUs. And so that is my major research area. And that's what I do. I have a book in progress. That's what my dissertation was on. My publications are coming out about American presidents and historically Black colleges. But that is a very, very significant relationship. And I think now we are starting to understand that. And I understood early on at the beginning of my research that it was a disconnect between how the American presidents and HBCUs have a very intrinsic relationship, and that it was not very well understood how HBCUs became the first set of institutions to have their own White House office. And this White House office came in 1980. It didn't come in the 60s. So that's my second area of my primary area of research is the White House Initiative on HBCUs or American presidents and Black colleges. And secondly is HBCU studies as an academic discipline.
So thank you both for that amazing set of information, set of passion about your research. And this is why we wanted to convene, because both of you have unique approaches to your work in terms of what you're researching about, but it's amazing how you all are contributing to the work and contributing to us investigating and asking more questions. So as both of you were talking, I had a question. I had initially wanted to kind of start with talking a little bit about the rise of HBCUs in the public sphere, or the re-rise, I would say, even though that's not a word, but this idea that all of a sudden, because of people like Vice President Harris and Stacey Abrams and Keisha Bottoms, people like that who have become into our purview, particularly reminding us of women's work as a result of graduating from HBCUs. And so I'm just curious about how do you feel like they have inspired persons who maybe did not understand HBCUs? Because as you all were talking, there was this moment of, yes, we have been in a space of being apologetic about being HBCUs, as opposed to helping people understand who we are, what we provide, and quite frankly, how we have led the way. And so I'm just curious about how has any of this resurgence of the HBCU for people who are not necessarily HBCU affiliates, how has that inspired you?
Yeah, it's an interesting predicament, right? When you have to create these organizations in order to educate your communities. And then you fast forward, and after the walls of Jim Crow come tumbling down, now you have to defend your existence. You have to defend the work that you do, even though you have, a century and a half in some cases, or thereabouts, 142 in the case of Florida Memorial University, of history, of work, of graduates, of lives improved. When we talk about social mobility, that has really been the business of HBCU since their founding. And so I would probably liken it to what we saw previously with the Different World and Bill Cosby. I know that's what put HBCUs on my radar. I think we're in yet another one of those moments. I would be very interested to hear Dr. Mango's analysis of what we see, because I think between President Obama, our last president, and now this administration with Biden and an HBCU graduate who is now in the White House, I've seen this push and pull and this debate over who loves HBCUs best, really, in some ways. I think that there has been a recognition of the importance that we play not only in the landscape of education, and really the outsized impact, if we're going to be honest about it, especially when it comes to the production of our Black leadership, and people who are in high-ranking positions across this country. But when we look about the political power of HBCUs and their alumni, I think that has also, that's been the transition that I've seen. I think back to that photo op that President Trump called of the HBCU presidents, and his constant, when he was accused of being racist or doing something that was against the Black community, he would always, hold up his support for historically Black colleges. It's quite a sea change, I think, in some ways to see. And then you add to that, I wrote a piece for the South Florida Times kind of dealing with this, Mackenzie Scott and her infusion of capital into so many HBCUs, none in Florida. I'm sad to report. We are hoping for maybe one more round that'll drip down our way. But I think that the type of money, the type of investment she made in the future of HBCUs not only is welcome, well-deserved, it works towards closing this wealth gap and the gap that exists in access to capital. But I'm hoping that in the long term, it encourages other philanthropists to take a second look at the work, at the legacy of HBCUs, and to make similar investments. And so I think it's a particular moment. I think all of us should be, that are involved in leadership, should be working out how we can capture the energy of this moment to our benefit, and continue to do the work that we've been doing and do it better.
Thank you so much. And I concur with you, Dr. Hobbs. It's interesting. Oftentimes when you're in a renaissance or when you're in a dark age or when you're in a revolution or something to that sort, you don't know it until historians later come back and say, that was the era of X, Y, and Z. And I have purposely made a decision to try to capture, as a historian, what will this age be known as 100, 200? And I really think that right now we are in a Black college renaissance. Mm-hmm. I think that the Renaissance, just like during the Harlem Renaissance, I don't think they said that we're in the Harlem Renaissance. But I think that it's important to point out, and it's important to understand that we're in a Black college renaissance right now. That's my position. And the reason for that is because HBCUs have emerged as the victors of not just African American, but of American history, with a history that's so complicated, like many institutions in America. It's very interesting to note that when you have a group of institutions who have that's why historically, my research has shown that historically HBCUs have done well under Republican presidencies. And because they have epitomized this conservative ideology, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps with meager resources and putting your head down and getting the job done. Now, I would say that there is some nuance in that. And that nuance is that oftentimes early on, white financiers of Black education was about controlling Black education in many ways, although they couldn't entirely control education. But there has been definitely I would say an insurgence of HBCUs as victors in American and African American history. And the reason for that is not just only about Kamala Harris and Warnock and Stacey Abrams. It's about Martin Luther King. It's about Booker T. Washington. It's about W.E.B. Du Bois. It's about the Thurgood Marshall. It's about the list of prominent Black people who have emerged to basically advocate and define what America should look like. These discussions have largely percolated and find themselves at HBCUs and found themselves on national stages and international stages. So HBCUs are just now catching up. We're in, history is a process. We are in the process of calibrating this history and calibrate. That's why I'm a big proponent of my HBCU studies degree. How do we measure this? How do we capture this? How do we reproduce this if we don't have systems in place to do that? So we are in a process of calibration right now. We are in an HBCU renaissance right now with Deion Sanders and the NBA and everybody is HBCU'd out. Now, we had that in the 90s. And my argument is the reason why we had it in the 90s is because of the creation of the White House Initiative on HBCUs in 1980. Now, that story has yet to be told. Well, I mean, it's coming out in the Journal of Public History for more reference purposes. But the reason why I argue it was a golden era in HBCU history in the 1990s is because of the creation of the White House Initiative on HBCUs in the 1980s, because HBCUs were actually on the chopping block because of integration and desegregation. So the HBCU community said, wait a minute, we want civil rights, but we don't want them at the expense of our institutions. So you mean that, you're going to classify us and sue us for being, so that's how they ended up getting their own White House office. And then they got an infusion of federal dollars into the schools, and they were able to, now that, you'll see a direct correlation between HBCUs moving from college status to university status during this era. A lot of the HBCUs became moved from colleges to universities after the 1980s and the 1990s. They got an expansion of money, enrollment, resources, and everything. And I argue that it was from the White House initiative on HBCUs. Although some people argue that the office is futile, I fervently disagree with that, because I know the condition that HBCUs were in before the office had to be created. And it's very significant that HBCUs have their own White House office. So I would just say, in terms of the question about where we are at this space and time, I would just end my comments by saying it's a lot of nuances to that, but I would say we are at this position, at this space and time, during the Black Lives Matter era, Black Lives Matter and mass protests, during the era of mass cancel culture. HBCUs, it's very difficult to cancel us. Like I said, we have a history, we have a pedigree, we are emerging as the victors. We are emerging as the victors in African American and American history. And that's another reason why I created HBCU Studies, is because I find it problematic that during Black History Month, we talk about Martin Luther King, we talk about Booker T. Washington, but very rarely in K through 12 or in Black History Month programs do we ever hear about how their HBCU educations provided the space for them to become the activists that they were. So this is about HBCUs finally getting their due for their contributions, but I fear that without a system, without us having a system in place to truly study this on an intrinsic level, we're studying everybody else but ourselves. Until we truly take responsibility for studying ourselves, claiming ourselves, defining ourselves not just graduated scholars, not just scholars who have PhDs, not just from the K through 12 granular forensic level, I fear that we might miss an opportunity. So that's why HBCU Studies is about expanding this system, not just on our institutions, but how can we replicate what HBCUs have done? Okay, they produced Kamala Harris. We have something to offer. We have something to offer that people, diversity training, K through 12, policy, government, we have something to offer. We have a system, but we have to define it and we have to capture it. We have to capitalize off of it and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mango. What I want to do is have Dr. Price introduce herself. And then I have a follow-up question for y'all that is around what was just discussed. So Dr. Price, thank you for coming, and we really appreciate and are really excited. We've had some really robust conversation thus far.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm just going to go to class for a little while and then we're going to quit and then I will just pop over here. And somehow I lost track of all of that. And then I realized what time it was. So excuse my tardiness and thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Melanie Price. As she said, I am the director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice at Prairie View, which is a new center created 9 months ago in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. George Floyd in particular hit the Houston area very strongly because his whole entire family was here. And so we started the Center for Race and Justice, and eventually the money was given to name it after Ruth Simmons. I also direct their African American Studies Initiative, which is an effort to bring an increased level of Black studies to Prairie View's campus. And what has ultimately resulted from that is a proposal that has been submitted. We are a part of the Texas A&M system. And so, all new majors must go through a proposal process. And so we are in the proposal process to offer a BA in African American Studies that we are hoping will be online in the fall of 2022. And so I should also say that Prairie View is my alma mater. So I graduated from there as well. Me, my twin sister, my nephew, my niece, my nephew's wife, and I have a cousin there right now. So we are very much entrenched. I wouldn't even say in HBCUs, I would just say in this HBCU, although I do have a sister who went to Texas Southern, but we try to ignore that in this family. And so I'm a political scientist by training. Really, race and politics is my area of study. But mostly what I'm doing now is sort of institution building work back at my alma mater, where I've been for 2 years. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Does that get you enough?
That is great. Thank you.
Okay, good.
And then, so we'll continue with the conversation.
Mm-hmm, please.
I wanted to ask a question about the idea of us having an HBCU studies as has been presented, mm-hmm. And to me it's a novel idea, right? We didn't really think about that before, and so I appreciate that being put on the radar. I'm curious though, as we were talking about the resurgence of HBCUs, or this attention, I'll say, for those people who particularly are outside of the HBCU space. And I'm curious, what do you all think this means very specifically for women scholars at HBCUs? Do you see a translation of opportunity here?
I'll jump in and say a couple of things. I would say, going back to the names that have already been called, these HBCU graduates that are in the limelight, I feel like Black women are finally getting the spotlight that they have long deserved. I think that Kamala Harris, for better or worse, has given us a platform and a spotlight. And it wasn't just her, right? It was all of the Black women who supported her. It was what we know about Black women's participation in the electoral politics in this country. I think that I finally saw at long last some respect for how we show up, the way that we lead, the way that we organize our communities that may have been new for others, but for all of us, especially here on this call, we know that it's just as the tip of a very deep and wide iceberg that Black women have been doing this. To use some of what I saw in the prep notes, when and where we enter, the entire race enters with us. And so I am really inspired, and I believe that moving forward, I would love to see more Black women get acknowledged for the leadership that they often do, for not enough pay. And we really begin to embrace Black women as leaders in this community, and that they don't have to take a back seat to anyone else. And I will say, for me at my HBCU, I just want to connect with Dr. Price and the institute that we started here at Florida Memorial last July, our FMU Social Justice Institute, which I lead, and it's been a vision I've had for quite some time, although we found our moment last year. And it was an attempt to connect what I know about our history and the history of lynching and racial violence in this country. Was definitely sparked by the murder of Trayvon Martin. I'm the mother of 2 African-American boys, and as a result of me being here, we learned that Sabrina Fulton is actually a graduate of ours, and we worked with her and the Trayvon Martin Foundation, which has been located here on our campus since 2014. And I always knew that the next level of this, to kind of picking up with Dr. Mango, is for us to begin to interrogate and bring to bear that empirical research that we are known for in the academy, to intentionally tackle some of these sticky questions. And so the Social Justice Institute here is configured as a solutions-focused think tank, but we want to move into the space as a research institute where we are bringing aboard scholars, encouraging existing faculty to research in these 8 areas of focus, whether it be economic justice, health justice, given what we see with COVID-19, environmental justice, educational justice, to begin to answer some of the questions that exist here for us in our community in Miami Gardens, in our region, and then just echo out from there. I believe firmly that HBCUs are the place where this should happen, that we have the ability to produce the knowledge that helps us to discover, uncover, and create policy recommendations to address the racial disparities that are rife in our society. And so I'm inspired by the example that I see at Prairie View. Got another really strong rattler there in Dr. William Guzman. Maybe he's but yeah, I think it's our time, and time for Black women, for sure.
One of the things I'll say is, I think there are lots of Black women doing really interesting work at Black colleges, but I think there's also still work to do around that. We are 150 years old. Ruth Simmons is our first female president, and she came 3 years ago. And there are lots of schools who can say they've never had a female president, right? And as we think about that, then we need to start thinking, what are the reasons behind the lack of women at the heads of these institutions? And so I think that there's work to be done. I think that we need to think about, one of my long-term goals is, after we get African American studies up and running, is for us to really think about next a women's studies program, right? Thinking about the fact that race and gender are, of course, intermingled in ways that are difficult to separate. And so we need to figure that thing out. And so, but the thing I also wanted to say about that is, I mean, I just came in on the middle of your HBCU studies thing, but I'm all for it, because I think there's a way in which we need to understand our own histories and impacts better. But I think that goes further than that. So the HBCU studies is important. One of the things we're doing with our African American Studies program is requiring our students to take courses in public history and to do a public history internship, right? Because what we also need is to preserve these spaces, right? Our archives need to be better. The way we talk about ourselves in the media needs to be better. The way we talk about ourselves with each other needs to be better, right? So I love the war stories that people have about their years at HBCUs, and I have some of my own, right? You know, I remember the time the power went out. All of y'all can fill in the story probably after that. And I don't even know you, and I know it actually happened. But I think also the ways that we talk about these spaces, we need to think about the ways in which sometimes even our own discussions of them critically undervalue their impact on not just on our own lives, but on society in general, right? And undermines your children's willingness to go there. And so I think there are lots of things that can be talked about in terms of gender, lots of things that can be talked about in terms of HBCU studies that are particularly interesting in this moment. While we're hot, all of the things need to be, HBCU studies needs to be on the table. African American studies needs to be on the table for more Black colleges. Women's studies needs to be on the table for Black colleges. All of these things we need to figure out those departments in our HBCUs where no women are and have never been, and figure out how we're going to enter those spaces. I just send long complaints, by the way, to people. Do you know there are no women, even though it's none of my business, but I'm like, do you know there are no women in such and such?
But you know, you brought, both of y'all brought a really good point around the idea of how women, you know, with the centers that you all are running and establishing, there's this moment for me of reflecting on the ways in which women do some of the brunt of the work, not some of, but do the brunt of the work, right? In a very particular way, and in a way that often doesn't get recognized or doesn't have anyone kind of championing or saying, these people are really at the forefront, right? And I've wondered, you know, for years in being in social justice work, oftentimes social justice work is looked at as a lesser type of work, if you will. Whether that's true or not is a whole other conversation, but it's work of the heart, right? But I appreciate that how you all are approaching it and speaking to it is about being able to codify where there are moments in our experiences that do not live up, and being able to say through writing, through scholarship, this is where we have housing discrepancies. This is how the economic situation is impacting. This is how health disparity is impacting. And so I'm curious about, have you all had experiences where you've had to speak in a voice that you don't usually use every single day? That's the way I kind of describe it, in order to push forward that your scholarship is valid, for a lack of a better way to say that.
I would say that, and I'll address this question, but I wanted to kind of chime in on maybe a solution. Yes, women, we are, you know, and it's interesting because when you look at history and you see how this has some parity with, white male patriarchal society, even the way our churches are often organized, and a lack of Afrocentricity as well. I mean, it's a lack of understanding how the place and role that women often had in Africa, how they had, they ran the marketplace, they had very prominent positions in many societies. And, how do we even implement that into our, HBCUs are very conservative. We don't tend to even look at our pre-slavery identity for guidance on how to move forward. But I would just say that one of the issues, I think, is a lack of, we don't have enough of what we're doing now. I know health is doing it. We have our, kind of silos of art, but we don't have, like a silo we meet. I mean, even if we had a chapter or something that met at a silo or association of Black women at HBCUs or something of that sort, where we can actually, do this more often. I feel comfortable. I feel like I'm with my sisters and, just by being here. So I think, just organization, looking at it and organizing in a way and where we can have that discussion, where we can discuss our issues and where we can see how to move our issues forward as well. So that might be another solution as well. And I said I was going to answer the second one question, but I forgot. I'm sorry. Can you remind me of? Okay.
About championing women's issues or the ways you've had them.
Okay. Yes. Yes. I also think that's important as well, championing women's issues. And we see that, women make up more than half of the human population, but it's really sad to say that we are in this state, but it's a process. History is a process. We are in a process. So we see it in terms of us being in a process. I think that will help us figure out how to move forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Sometimes it's tricky for me to talk about this because I think it's important to state from the outfront that I showed up here as a full professor. And so that meant that I wasn't going to go through any other promotions, right, before I came here. But I think it's also important to say that one of the reasons that I feel even more duty bound to speak up on some of these issues related to women is because I am a person for whom the threat of not promoting doesn't exist, right? And so I think what is really needed is more women professors who, when they get power, advocate for other women, right? And I'm not saying they don't, I'm saying it's really the only way forward, because there are many times when junior professors, period, are swamped with the amount of classes that we ask them to teach, are swamped with the fact that they need to get their research done, and that then to ask them to use whatever capital they have left to then be a champion of anything, I think I find very difficult. But one of the things that I do see for myself is what is the hit going to do to me is sort of the question I ask myself. And I'm like, so sometimes when I'm talking to junior scholars, men and women, I'm like, oh, don't ask that. Let me ask. There's no need for you to even put your name out there like that. Just don't do it. I'm going to ask and then I'll tell you what they say, right? Because there's a need, there's sometimes this expectation, it seems to me, that you teach all of these classes, that you do your research, and that somehow to complain is to deny the mission of what it is you're actually doing, or somehow to complain is to act like you don't understand what happens here. You don't understand our tradition. This is when I was 30 years ago, I taught 6 classes a year, right? And it's like to demand that in this new moment that we have different kinds of expectations as we get these large scale donations, as we start to improve our improve our standing in rankings? As we start to do these things, are we actually in fact building up people who need to be built up? And in many Black spaces, including HBCUs and many Black institutions, I think the need for women's work to be valued is a need that is an ongoing challenge to get people to do, right? Because it's like, they do it, they do the work. And of course they did it. We didn't have to worry about it. I'm just going to tell you what the dream is. And then you're going to show up and make it happen. And then I'm going to stand up in front of the mic and explain this great thing that's happening, right? And so part of it is, I think, about us sort of, helping each other out where you can, using your power and whatever power you have, using it in ways that not only benefit you, but uplift other people who are in the process.
Can I say two things in response to that? The first thing I want to echo is mentorship. And taking care of Black women scholars. And I have seen, even at our HBCUs, the Boys Club organize, protect, groom, advance people of their ilk, and Black women getting left out in the cold, doing a whole lot of work. But without the proper guidance, without that inclusion, without the invitation to co-author, the invitation to co-present, some strategic advice that you point to, Dr. Price, I've watched careers languish and get extinguished and have to be redirected. And it's disturbing to me. And so I want to echo that really is a need that exists. The one thing I will say too, in terms of what to do about it, what has come up for me as we begin to engage more with our social justice community, is that many of the times it's Black women who are doing this work, thankless work, important work, but not getting what they need. And so one of the ideas I brought to bear for our institute is the creation of what we're calling an advocate in residence. And so everybody's familiar with a scholar in residence. People are familiar with artists in residence. We decided to embed a social justice practitioner who is a woman, Valencia Gunder, who is co-founder of the Smile Trust that works with our unsheltered communities here. She does a lot of everything, climate justice advocacy, which is really important for us here in South Florida, as Black people live on the highland as the oceans rise, and what that means for continued development in this crazy, unaffordable housing market that we exist in down here. She's a part of the movement for Black Lives, but we brought her here and we paid her to engage with our students. But my hope is that we are furthering her work, elevating her platform, putting a little cash in her pocket as she enriches our campus. And I foresee as we move forward that there will be a number of these advocate in residence that will be Black women who are doing the work. And that's a point of pride for me very early on in this work.
We really need to talk, because we're having an activist in residence is what we call it in our center. So it's one of the key features of our center, really. And we're in the process of trying to figure out sort of who the first person will be. But it's a clear understanding that, I keep telling people act like the only political, like in the 1960s, HBCUs were political, and then nothing happened. And then Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock popped out of nowhere, as if to say that our very work in terms of what we do in sort of educating our students isn't social justice work, right? When you are taking kids like at our campus who are nearly 70% Pell Grant eligible or first generation college student, and you are getting them, and they have been failed, many of them in their K through 12 education, and you are turning them into productive engineers and architects and teachers, that's social justice work, right? And so there's a way in which I think we have allowed people to think that we are no longer incubators of Black leadership, right? There's a way in which sort of we haven't, and part of that is your HBCU studies, part of that is the social justice part of that is the public history work of our African American Studies program. And that is to say, Stacey Abrams doesn't come out of nowhere. She comes out of a trajectory that continues to nurture Black and incubate Black leadership, right? That continues to create Black leaders, that continues to create places where the people all of you counted out are able to thrive. And so I think that's part of it too.
Do you think that as you all were talking about value and how we determine value for the work that we're doing, you all are doing, I'm wondering if that's part of it, right? So there's this idea that all of a sudden these people appeared and there aren't hundreds of other people that are similar because of the work that's already has been going on at HBCUs. And then getting more specifically around women scholars and how our work is valued or how your all's work is valued. And I'm just curious, you were able to give some really great advice around how to make sure that people you're advocating for other women scholars. I'm curious if you could put some language to value. And I know this is a tricky one, but I think it's important for people to hear a little bit about what does it mean to actually value women scholars at HBCUs, or what can it mean?
Well, I think first we have to understand, and I think that this is again, and I hate to keep sounding like a broken record about HBCU studies and HBCU history. We have to first really understand our history. We don't understand. I think that, as she was saying, and the way that we talk about HBCUs, we're talking as if HBCUs had the resources, had the same environment, had the same conditions as PWIs to compete and educate their students under the same pretenses. We are just now as a people, okay, and even as a school, able to even have a little breathing room to discuss, to not be in a sense of desperation for our survival. So this is why we have this space right now where we can have this glimmer. I'm not saying that these discussions couldn't happen previously, but when you're in survival mode, when you are under when you're under some type of, I don't want to use, when you're in a sense of survival, these larger, broader issues go to the wayside. And you're just trying to keep the lights on. You're just trying to figure out if the budget is going to pass, and if you're going to be able to do this, or are they talking about merging, or when you have to exist like that, it's very difficult to bring these type of issues to the forefront. So I think first, before we move, I'm not saying that we should not talk about how to value Black women, but I think first we have to understand that valuing Black women at HBCUs is a very unique proposition, because it's coming under the pretense of all of this discrimination, systemic inequities, the violence, the brutality, and the goal, the mission, the very, very in-depth mission of HBCUs of turning the formerly enslaved into African Americans. That's a very difficult task in itself. So inside of that, we do have to extrapolate the what women have offered and to that. But I think first we have to acknowledge that this is not normal, what HBCUs had to emerge out of. That this was out of under duress that our history emerged. This emerged out of a sense of duress in a way. So valuing Black women in that context and measuring their contributions, I think, take a different formula when we consider the real history of HBCU. So thank you.
Add one thing to that, and it actually occurred to me while you were talking, Dr. Price, but you also kind of brought it up again, Dr. Mango, and it was you, Dr. Price, talking about how we talk about ourselves, how we talk about HBCUs. For me, my thoughts immediately went to another one of our areas of focus in terms of helping people to understand systemic racism. and how it has created the landscape that we have inherited. Of course, when you talk about the historic underfunding of our institutions, the lack, the racial wealth gap, and the lack of access to capital over decades, century and a half of history. Of course, our infrastructures at these institutions are not going to look like many PWIs. And so I think those things have to be put into context for people, lest they make the mistake that I think Dr. Price was hinting towards of, the mislabeling, misunderstanding, misinterpreting, and, blaming the victims in some ways. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but you take my point.
I think there's some really concrete things we can do to help value the work of women. We cannot saddle them down with a bunch of service. We can look around at our leadership and ask the question, really look at it and be intentional about gender equity in the leadership on campus. That is, have you ever had a female provost? Have you ever had a female dean? Why can't you have a female dean of engineering? Why can't you have a female dean of the College of Business, right? Really looking around and saying, when we look at our leadership and see whether or not there's gender equity in our leadership. There's a thing that sometimes happens where people are like, this young lady is having a problem, and I thought it'd be better if she talked to you as a female professor. And I'm like, nope, I'm no more equipped to deal with this woman than you. I'm not a psychologist. And so I don't necessarily know, but it's also a way of saying, I couldn't possibly help her. Why don't I just send her over to you as soon as she says something that I'm uncomfortable with? And I'm not saying that there aren't times where I take on that kid. I'm saying sometimes we use it as a reason to push advising off. Women need to advise other women. Sometimes advisors who are paid to do it need to advise people. And so I think there are ways in which we can actually value Black women's work in ways that are actually concrete. That is, do we fund things related to women on campus other than Women's History Month? Do we ask women on our campus how they're feeling about what's going on their campus, right? Do we look around at our leadership and have women's voices at the tables where decisions are made in presidential cabinets, in dean's positions? Like, that's pretty simple to do if you're intentional about it, right?
Yes, I agree. But it also, I completely agree, but it also has to do with our ability to be self-determined. I think that's what I was just kind of hinting at. We've often seen ourselves through the context, through the lens, and kind of mimic what we thought white society and our white funders and our white accrediting boards, how we thought they wanted to see us. Did they want to see a woman at the table? Did they want to see a woman in a dean's position? Did they want to see a woman president? So I think with that, it requires, like you said, those concrete questions, but it also requires a really hard look at ourselves to say that we haven't actually, that we've been viewing ourselves oftentimes through the lens of how white society we thought that white society wanted to see us, with our, respectability politics and things of that sort. So we have to tackle both issues, both the concrete and both our kind of psychological orientations towards, appeasing this, white society as well.
And I appreciate all of the comments that you all have made about this idea of valuing. That's why I posed it, right? Because it's a really complicated space, but it's something that we have to be thinking about, because to your point, if we are to continue to be focused in on supporting women as scholars in HBCUs, there's a lot of work that still has to be done, and it has to be named. And if we can't name it, then people can't address it. And so I appreciate you all trying to name it, and not trying, but naming it, and then also identifying ways to go forward. As you all we're at 4:03, we've got about 10 more minutes, if I can keep you all. I have a question around not specifically your scholarship, but historically, who are some of the women that you have learned about that are HBCU grads, HBCU at your HBCUs now, or research that you've done around women in HBCU spaces that you just want to uplift and maybe share a little bit about, that maybe people may not know who those persons are?
So I was very lucky in that when I came to Prairie View, we had a woman, Jewel Prestige, who ran the Benjamin Banneker Honors Program. And she was one of the first Black women to get a PhD in political science. And she had done a whole career at Southern and basically got all these students through PhD programs there. And then she came to Prairie View, and in the Honors College, she wasn't just focused on political science. She really was, everybody who came through the Honor Society, she thought they should all get a PhD, every single one of them. And so from the day you started there, from the day you showed up, she would bring other PhDs from the Houston area, or you could be a doctor or a dentist, but you need to have a terminal degree. And she would bring like prominent people in to talk to us. And she would tell us, you know, after our freshman year, you need to start applying for summer research. And because of that, you know, I can say that I know 5 Black people with PhDs in physics. 5. And that's a lot, because it ain't that many Black people with PhDs in physics. I know like 4 people with PhDs in education. My sister and I both have PhDs in political science. And so there was a way in which she saw for us, she was both trying to replicate herself in that she wanted to make future professors to run these schools, and she was trying to help us see bigger than ourselves. And those things collided in her, like, okay, when are you going to graduate school? And I know people who came through that honors college who still are like, this was 30 years ago, and they're like, you know, I never got that PhD. Like, still thinking about it. I'm like, I think she's okay with it. And so she's gone now. She's no longer alive. And I think about her often as I walk through campus, because of the ways that I showed up there not knowing anybody who had done the things that she had done, and she didn't care about that. She said, here's a person who can do whatever they want to do. And so I always love to call her name in these spaces. And of course, it's just amazing to work for Ruth Simmons. I mean, I don't even know how else to say that. I mean, it's just
color me jealous.
Yeah.
She's amazing to work for. She is as generous as she seems. She is as thoughtful and strategic as she seems. It is a moment for Prairie View. It feels like a Cinderella moment for people who are willing to take the Cinderella ride, right? There are always the naysayers, but for those who are willing to go on the ride, this is a Cinderella moment for us. And I just hope, and the work that I'm doing, I put things in place that allow us to continue the opportunity that she gave us in this moment.
Yeah. And that was absolutely, as I've been a fan for her as I've watched her career, that was absolutely no slight.
Me too. I'm from Houston. So imagine being from Houston and knowing who this woman is. And I'm like, I'm going to meet her one day. And actually did. It's a very nice.
Yeah. And I say that, I do not mean any slight to Dr. Japhus Hardrick and his administration. Very proud to be a part of it here. He is a tremendous supporter of women. I will say that my boss, the provost and executive vice president, is Dr. Adrienne Cooper. Many of our AVPs are women. And so we were just talking yesterday, and he was quite proud of his track record of grooming women for leadership positions. So it feels good to be. I also had the privilege of witnessing the administration of the first female president here at Florida Memorial University. She's gone on and is doing amazing things, but that's Dr. Rosalind Clark Artis, who's now at Benedict College. And it's been quite a pleasure to watch her success. I'll call a few names. I always have to talk about Ida B. Wells, a graduate of Russ College. 5 foot tall with a pillbox hat on, as the story goes, but used her pen as a sword and a weapon in defense of Black people and in defense of Black men in particular. When you talk about her anti-lynching and her investigative journalism around lynching, I have to call the name of Dr. Elizabeth Merle Dawson at what is now the Meek Eaton Black Archives Research Center and Museum on the campus of Florida A&M University. She was has been my long-term mentor from the time I was an undergraduate, and still will mark up whatever I send to her mercilessly. But that's what I count on her for. And it's actually been her critical eye that she's helped me to develop that has been a part of my success, for sure. And then lastly, I want to call the name of one of my colleagues, Dr. Rosemary Stiffen. Her department, her leadership in the Department of Health and Natural Science has given birth to the, as we understand it, the only two Black women PhDs in the field of radiochemistry. There are only two of them, as I understand them. Both of them attended Florida Memorial University and graduated with their undergraduate degrees here. So that's when we talk about the track record of HBCUs in STEM, but in particular, the track record of HBCUs producing women in STEM, that there's a real story to be told there.
And I would
You're
like,
muted. Okay.
of course, Mary McLeod Bethune, you know, just the giant, the legend. You know, Suzanne Malveaux, Janetta Cole, I mean, just so many. But, you know, I can recall being a young, my mom was a teacher, and there was a lot of teachers that had went to HBCUs before, and they worked in these segregated schools. And my mom was the PE teacher, and everybody said, Cheryl, your mom used to really teach PE. Before we could play volleyball, we had to know the dimensions of the court. We had to know the length of the hockey stick. We had to know what size. And it was those teachers like that I grew up around. Our kids played, I mean, all of us, we played together. They had, you know, Ann J. Stewart, Wilma Scott, and those old school HBCU educated teachers from K through 12, all the way up to when I was a student at Grambling. And like she said, Dr. Belton, who is still the chair in the history department at Grambling, coming in here in class and saying, who's going to get a PhD in history? I think you should get a PhD. It was like Oprah. You should get a PhD. You should get everybody. And, you know, that really guided that thought in my consciousness. And it was so many women at Grambling that embraced me. Dr. Rose Harris, Dr. Sarah Dennis. It was just, oh man, just such an embrace. Like mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers. And, you know, we shared so much. You know, and oh man, when I got to Morgan, Dr. Deborah Newman-Ham, who is still my mentor today. And I think, you know, and I try to replicate that with my students. Sometimes, you know, I'm like, because I know what these women did for me at those particular points in my life. And so I think that a lot of us have experienced that. And that's one of the magical elements of going to attend an HBCU, that type of camaraderie with your professors, that it's a family experience. It's a village type of atmosphere oftentimes. And I certainly wouldn't be here today if it were not for those women who uplifted me and embraced me and explained to me simple things like, what's an assistant professor? What is a credit hour? What is an associate professor? Just things that I didn't know. You know, I just didn't understand. You know, my mom and dad, they did the best they could with the education they had. But I needed other people in those roles to explain this system to me. Now, what is it I'm doing here as a cop? Now, how do I do this? Now, come here, let me read your graduate. You know, this is how you get in. This is a tier. This is like to really explain this to me, to explain my place in that time in time and space. So I'm just so honored and just to have women who embrace me through all my challenges as a student at a HBCU. I'm just thankful.
I want to say thank you all for just your honesty, your willingness to share, your eagerness. I mean, I think it speaks to the type of scholars that you all are, but more specifically, the type of people that you all are and type of women that you all are. And as we get ready to close, I do want to ask one final question. As I'm thinking about my work and invite you all, if you have not already submitted something to the Deccan Journal for Health, we have a great opportunity. It will be our inaugural issue coming out in a couple of months. And so we look forward to not only you all, but anyone else creating a submission and submitting to us. We also want to ask you just a simple question about what would you say to young women scholars or women scholars in general, to inspire them and encourage them to keep going, and to encourage them to just do their very best and contribute?
One of the things that I think happens with women scholars is we often take anxiety to mean stop, or we take feeling uncomfortable about what we've written to mean stop, right? And the longer you've sort of done this work, the more you realize that some men will turn in complete garbage with lots of confidence, and women will hold an award winning book for 20 years because of nervousness, right? And I want to encourage women to put their stuff out there earlier, sooner, and faster. You have things written in draft form, consider sending them out. You get rejected that day, think about where you're going to send it next, because just because those people didn't want it doesn't mean that nobody wants it. And part of the work that I do with the people that I have come to mentor, who are younger than me, is half the job is saying, girl, that's a good idea. You should put it out there. No, go ahead. Go ahead and tell somebody. Go ahead and put it out there. Go ahead. Like, that's half of the battle, I think, sometimes with women scholars, because we often want perfection. And part of that is because we've had to do so many battles around whether or not we're good enough, whether or not our work is good enough, that we are sometimes afraid to put our words out there, because that is a reflection of us, right? And you don't want that to be slapped down. And I just say to anybody who's listening, and to any woman I can talk to, put your stuff out there, because if you saw some of the stuff that people, I've reviewed books, I've reviewed journal articles, I have worked with departments on their accreditation, I have done all of those things. And if you saw some of the stuff that people put forward, you would have 14 things published right now. But really sort of get out of your own head and get that stuff onto somebody else's desk.
As you were talking, something came up, and I'm going to speak to my testimony. Last Tuesday, I celebrated the 25th anniversary of my oldest child. I was a 20-year-old junior at Florida A&M when I carried him. And I just want to say that there is a path forward. I remember being confused. I remember feeling that I disappointed my family. But there was nothing wrong with what was between my ears, and with support from my network, from my spouse at the time, we were able to make it through. I don't think I could have ever imagined what my path would have been like. And so I just want to offer that up to any young woman who may be out there in that situation.
And I think I would like to offer, don't be afraid to be creative. I think, I grew up in the country with horses in my yard, out in the bayou. And, so I had to be tough. I was the youngest. And I think that, having those Louisiana roots and coming from deep South Louisiana, I think that did something in terms of my competitiveness, in terms of, I never really, even in my PhD programs and stuff, I didn't meet, I don't know if I knew, I don't know. I just never really had that much intimidation. I didn't feel intimidated. I more so felt creative. I felt like we could work together. I felt like we could join together. And so I think that I would tell young women to, if you, to assert yourself, respectfully, it's okay to assert yourself. It's okay to be creative. It's okay to put forth your ideas. Oftentimes they may, like she said, they may be rejected, but somebody else might like them, I think also finding ways for cooperation is always good. Finding ways for consensus building is also good as well. And so I think that's what I would say. Don't be afraid of your strength. That's what got us this far. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of your creativity. Although I'm just an assistant professor, I have not been afraid of that element in me. And I credit my Louisiana roots to that.
Can I add one last thing that I would offer, especially if you have students who are watching? And I think all of us have experienced this. And that is, you go to graduate school, you start to get jobs, and most people have never heard of Prairie View. I mean, Black people have, but I spent the vast majority of my career on predominantly white campuses in the Northeast. And they have absolutely no connection to what the SWAC is, to the fact that Prairie View exists, any of these things. And sometimes people will say, oh, I've never heard of that, as a way of saying, if I've never heard of it, it used to really bother me when I first, left home. I never heard of that. And then I started to tell myself, yeah, you haven't, but we still in this room together. You haven't, but we're still on the same committee. You haven't, but we're still doing the same thing. And so I really want to encourage those students who leave HBCUs and sometimes end up with people saying like, oh, I've never heard of that school, or, oh, this is the one thing I've heard of that school. And as a way of trying to minimize your experience, to say, you haven't. And yet we are still here together doing the same thing.
So we will end on that. And I just want to say, as we turn over to President Felton, I want to say thank you all so much for letting me spend a few minutes with y'all, listen to y'all. Y'all are definitely the truth. And so I'm appreciative of even having the opportunity to sit in the same space with you all. And I just hope that you all will continue to contribute in the ways that you are contributing mightily and through strength. And so, President Felton, thank you for the time. Thank you for allowing us to do this. Thank you, Health, for allowing us to do this. And I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Let me tell you, I said that I was going to listen over here for a second while I multitasked, but this has just been phenomenal. It is more than what I'd hope that people would get a chance to experience. It's just so amazing that each of you are brilliant and doing some powerful work. Dr. Price, you have me looking at my cabinet, not just the executive cabinet, but the administrative cabinet. And because I'm intentional about my representation and the equity. And I don't think there are enough women who are saying to administrations in this space that there's something wrong with this mixture here. And so I commend you for really talking about stuff that folk don't want to talk about. The patriarchal bullcrap malarkey that goes on at these conservative Black colleges is old hat. And folk like you, sisters like you, women like you, scholars like you, leaders like you, will be the genesis for the change. If you don't continue to push the needle, folk are going to be happy with the way things are. I'm just so proud, and I know that your presidents are really happy to have each of you, from Wilberforce, Virginia State, although they're riding on a high right now. Their president is out breaking folks' ankles and all that good stuff, to Florida Memorial, and obviously the iconic Dr. Ruth Simmons. You all are really lucky to have, I think, transformational leadership at your spaces too. I know you're presidents, but there are not enough women leading. And I believe that this conversation is one that is being held in silos, but I think those silos need to be broken. And I pledge here at Health, who we are unapologetically Black, don't care what's going on at a PWI, are not interested from a place of malice. We just know that there is a lot of the intelligentsia of our space is not shown in a way that it needs to be. And it is my singular focus to do my part in making sure that it is. So with a humble heart, we are grateful for you to have shared your brilliance with the space. And I'm really excited about what's next for each of you, and hope that there's an opportunity for us to collaborate more, so to highlight you and to pull from this great wealth of knowledge that you have. And a personal plug, we have the Heman Sweat Center for Social Justice here in leadership. And
we're gonna have to start an association of
just
HBCU social justice.
that's where I was going. That's where I was going. You know, there has to be, Tasha is doing a Center of Social Justice and this entrepreneurial focus up at Wilberforce. And I mean, there should be one of these on every one of our campuses. But we're just waiting for a sister to do what needs to be done. Because, when you peel layers back, you look behind movements, there lies the beautiful queen. I'm just excited because I'm in your backyard and we're going to be down at Prairie View trying to get some of that good ingenuity that you have down there. But on behalf of Health, our 342 fellows, we've been doing this work for 5-6 years quietly. It's just been about the work and nothing else. We're grateful for you and thank you for sharing with us, and look forward to watching you blow up in a great way, and hope that we're able to be around to assist in that. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Bye-bye now.